Last weekend I entered a 40-mile fell run. I'd had my eye on this race for the best part of 3 months, but 7 weeks ago disaster struck, and I sustained a pretty nasty injury to my right foot after running an ill-conceived solo ultramarathon. So after almost 2 months of zero running, the target time I'd been aiming for was blown out the water with this gap in my training. A few years ago I would have thrown in the towel. In fact, I wouldn't have even entered the race because I used to hate running. Running to me used to be a chore and was something grown-ups had to settle for when they become too old or lonely to play team sports anymore. But on Saturday the 4th of February, I was at the start line for this 40-mile race ready and raring to go. Because unlike my very breakable right foot, I've managed to make running an unbreakable habit. And not just because I'm a grown-up now with no mates, but because I've learned to love it and made it an integral part of my life. And here's how. I've broken down my own journey from someone that doesn't run and who finds it hard and boring, to someone that loves to run and has actively chosen to enter marathons and ultramarathons. And through this journey, I've not only managed to become fitter than I've ever been, and managed to trim up and lose some of the excess baby fat I was carrying, but I'm finding I also have so much more energy and drive in other aspects of my life as a result. And I've come up with the 3 key steps I took to make running an unbreakable habit, with the last one being almost certainly the most important for me, and the one that pulled me to the start line of this very race, despite a frustrating couple of months out of training. The first step I took was just to get going. I started running for the same reason a lot of people do. I wanted to be fit and healthy. I used to be pretty athletic as a teenager. I played team sports through school and university, but over time, due to injury, starting full-time work, and the lack of mates after leaving uni, I drifted away from rugby and football. I'd become unfit and was looking at getting back on the wagon. So at the start of last year, having moved to New Zealand and become even more socially isolated, I bought a pair of running shoes and started heading out for a jog once a week. And to begin with, it was pretty dull. I would head to the park next to my house and do several laps along a concrete path to make up 5k. But not only was it dull, it was hard. Despite being a semi-healthy guy in his 20s, running 5k was uncomfortable. I would try and get these runs over and done with ASAP. My legs would ache, I'd be panting for breath after the first kilometre, and I'd be counting down every tree I ran past in the endless loops of the park, constantly thinking how much longer. It sucked. And that's why it was the toughest step I had to take. I needed to make the active decision to get going, and my only motivation was some loose sense that it might be good for my health. So it was effectively a chore. Something I didn't want to do but felt I had to. The point is, if you're anything like me, you're probably not going to immediately love running. But much like my fell race at the weekend, where I'd already paid the registration fee before getting injured, I'd splashed out a decent pair of shoes, so I wasn't going to completely lay that money to waste. And when starting out, however thin or fragile your motivation is to get going, you just need to grasp it with both hands. It's easy to talk yourself out of it, or spend ages contemplating what you're going to do that you lose the initial drive you had. But like a lot of things in life, I'd recommend not to think about it too hard. A few years ago, if someone had told me I'd be the sort of guy that would drag himself out of bed on a grey Sunday morning in February to run 14 miles and climb 1,500 feet with no chance of getting a competitive time, I'd have thought you were taking a mick. I would have had a million reasons to back out. But I've made running an integral part of my life, so I'm not giving up that easy. But to begin with, you just need to grit your teeth and get out for a jog as soon as possible, and it will pay off as we move into step 2. My second tip, which is getting you one step closer to making running an unbreakable habit, is to get good. I made one huge mistake when I started running, which held back my progress for the first few months. But I'm going to let you in on how to avoid wasting your time like I did, and supercharge your progress. But when I started out, my aim was to get each run over and done with as quick as possible. I'd run each 5k as fast as I could, trying to improve on last week's time. But despite feeling like I was sprinting at a maximum effort and working as hard as I could, my times wouldn't budge. Which was pretty demotivating. Was running meant to be this hard? Well, given a few more weeks training like that, I probably would have given up. But after doing a bit of research, I came up with a different strategy. I would slow right down. Instead of sprinting each 5k, I'd run at a pace that kept me in heart rate zone 2, or a pace that I could still hold a conversation with someone. Theoretically, of course. And this felt odd to begin with. I was now running at barely a jog and being overtaken on my loops of the park by grannies on mobility scooters. How would running slower make me faster? But I kept going. I wasn't exactly winning any park runs at this pace, but at least my runs felt easier. So I did in a second 5k each week. Again, nice and slow, just putting in the distance. Over the next few weeks, I cautiously increased the distance I was running, until eventually I could run a 10k in one go, and was approaching a weekly mileage of around 15 miles. Only a couple of months earlier, I was barely finishing 5ks and being a total wreck for the next half hour as I waited for my heart rate to settle. But at this new, slower pace, I felt like I could just keep going. And what happened next really surprised me. After a couple of months training like this, I entered some park runs and ended up pushing myself a bit for the first time in ages. And I was fast. Not quite granny on a mobility scooter fast, but I was running 5k several minutes quicker than only a few months earlier. And I made all this progress without ever doing any speed or interval workouts. What I came to realise was that I'd been increasing my aerobic base, or my endurance, through all this easy zone 2 running. By simply running more miles each week, I was not only able to run further, but was also improving my top speed. I'd found a way to make running easier while still making progress. Even now, these slow-paced runs make up the majority of my weekly miles, and I've continued to be able to run further and further distances, and become fast enough to run a 5k in under 20 minutes. And when starting out, coming up with a running plan can seem confusing, but I found that just keeping things really simple was enough to make good progress. With all these miles in the bank over the last year, my running endurance is the best it's ever been. So much so that I was able to basically take 6 weeks off of running for my injured foot, and still semi-comfortably cover this 40-mile fur run last weekend. At this point, I was on my way to solidifying running as part of my routine. I enjoyed seeing the progress I was making, and I was feeling fitter. But what I haven't said to this point is that I've been here before. A few years back, I'd spent 6 months or so running pretty regularly. My in-laws and I decided to do an informal family half marathon, and I ran a lot, with less structure than I have now, but I enjoyed it and did the half marathon. I completed what I set out to achieve and had been fairly satisfied. But when the challenge was over, I lost my motivation and driving force, and I just stopped running. I had no structure or a reason to run anymore, and hadn't managed to build a habit, and didn't run again for 2 years. Life got in the way, and things other than running filled my routine. But over this last year, I've begun to understand something, and this is my final step to making running an unbreakable habit. When I started running last year when I moved to New Zealand, I didn't have a specific target or challenge in mind other than to get fit. I wasn't aiming to run a specific time at a race or event, nor was I trying to lose weight for a holiday or occasion. And this lack of structure could be a blessing or a curse depending on your perspective. But for me, without the confines of a countdown towards meeting a goal on a fixed date, I was able to take things at my own pace and explore the sport of running. This meant I could take the time to build my mileage gradually, and there wasn't an end point to my journey, after which point I'd feel like all my momentum would just stop. I used my newfound running abilities to explore the country I was living in. I got off the concrete path of my local park and onto the trails and into the hills. It didn't matter how fast or how far I was going, because there wasn't a specific goal in mind. I just went. I actively travelled to places I wouldn't have seen otherwise, and immersed myself in the environment. The longer I'd run for and the further I got off the beaten track, the more time and space I had with my own thoughts. Running became really cathartic and gave me time to reflect and be mindful. I'm sure I'm not the only person who can vouch that running has made me a happier person with more drive and vitality. And soon I started entering events. It began with park runs, but moved on to relay races, trail runs, fell runs, marathons, and now I've even got 2 ultramarathons coming up later this year. The purpose of these events wasn't to compete. I'm nowhere near good enough a runner to think I can post competitive times in these big races. It's to try something new. It's to maybe be better than I was before. And it's to be in amongst a positive atmosphere, meeting like-minded people with similar interests. And no, I'm not just looking for a few mates, alright, it's more than that. But through this process of exploration, I've started to decouple the idea that running was something I did exclusively for my health or fitness, or to smash a goal. It was no longer a chore. It was anything but that. It was something I started to love. There's nothing wrong with having goals or targets in your training. It's just I don't want them to be my sole justification to work out. James Clear talks about goal setting in his book Atomic Habits. He writes that goals can actually restrict happiness or enjoyment of an activity, because not only are you offsetting happiness until a future date, but your enjoyment is attached to your ability to achieve that goal. And if you don't, what next? He says the purpose of setting a goal is to win the game. The purpose of building systems, however, is to continue playing the game. And for me, I've been able to build systems that mean I enjoy the process of running, which keep me playing. I keep the majority of my runs slow-paced and easy, so it doesn't always feel like an effort. I try and get off-road at least a couple of times a week, onto softer surfaces or more interesting environments. I enter park runs or competitions semi-regularly to keep my training interesting and enjoy the atmosphere that comes with the events. I recognise a fitter and more active me is a happier and more energetic person, which keeps me motivated to stay in shape. And I use running as an excuse to travel and make frequent small trips away with my wife, making explorative long runs a feature of our breaks. So last weekend, a few months after a pretty significant injury, when in the past I might have lost all motivation to run or stay on track, there I was, plodding around the Leicestershire hills towards the rear of the pack on a grey and muddy day with a big fat smile on my face, back doing what I loved. And I hope you can find some of that too.